and then having recording in progress, right? And then a bit of a section on digital design and some kind of key questions that it's really useful to think about when approaching doing a digital process. And then go into some of the kind of tools that you might use and the different categories of tools that you might use for delivering a PB process. And you've all frozen for me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. That was a little bit worrying. All your videos have frozen. Okay, cool. So, digital engagement. What does digital engagement mean in the world today? It can mean loads of things and includes everything from like physical and social aspects of digital design through to like the software design. And you'll see on this page, we've kind of done a bit of an overview of some of the different things we can mean by digital design. Some of them will be really familiar. So there's some very kind of traditional methods like email and surveys have been around for several decades as ways of engaging with people. And as have things like Facebook and social networks, which have been around quite a long time now. More recently, it's kind of increasingly meant people using their phones. And during lockdown, it's meant people working in usually cluttered bedrooms and living rooms, often with kids and other dependents around them. So there's that kind of added aspect of people joining digital processes from a domestic space. And in the context of participatory and deliberative democratic processes, it might mean using kind of word visualization tools. So we've got that Wordle kind of cloud at the bottom there. It might mean trying to tap into local neighborhood groups or kind of local Facebook groups. That little app on the phone there is called Nextdoor, which is an app that you can use to find people who are living near you. Or it might be using things like digital whiteboards to do kind of ideation exercises where you get, which we've used as part of DEMOTEC to kind of bring together ideas and get people thinking a bit more visually. So, starter for 10. What are some of the opportunities with digital, and why might you use digital to engage with citizens? And I thought I'd start off just by putting that out there as a question to you all. Why might you use digital to engage with citizens?
I think one of the things for me is the wider reach potentially, and also if it doesn't need to be synchronous, so it's something that people can do in their own time rather than everybody having to be in the same place at the same time. So people can do it at their own pace in their own time.
Great. So yeah, reaching a wider audience and asynchronous participation, as you very kindly explained there, Corinne, that kind of being able to take part in their own time. Are there any other kind of reasons people might use digital for engaging with citizens that people can think of?
Yeah, a more targeted audience.
Yeah, so having a kind of a bit more of an understanding of your audience and being able to get targeted advertisement or maybe reach people who wouldn't be able to engage usually. I think that's Nigel. All your videos are frozen for me for some reason. Thanks, Nigel. Any other kind of opportunities or reasons you might use digital? Sorry, I won't keep you in suspense. So as Corinne said, being able to reach a wider audience and also being a bit more targeted with who you can reach. It also lowers some barriers to participation, so you can reach people who might not usually be able to engage in an in-person process due to other kind of commitments they might have or accessibility requirements. People might have dependents they need to look after, or they might not be able to physically get to a location. It also allows you to kind of create more standardized outputs, which can be really helpful if you're looking to pick things up and communicate them more widely, rather than it being a bunch of post-its that gets carried away by someone and then they need to turn that into something else in order to share it with the people who took part. It also doesn't need physical locations, which can be a bit of a cost barrier for holding processes, and a challenge for accessibility, as we've seen over COVID. And it can be good for long distance engagement, so bringing together people like in this meeting, who might never be able to actually meet together in person. And something that Corinne pointed out is it enables people who aren't able to take part at the same time to do so in their own time and their own kind of place and comfort. So that's usually called asynchronous participation. And you might also find different ways for them to participate asynchronously. So it might not need to be the same type of participation that they're doing at different times in their own ways. And these were some of the kind of reasons people might do PB. So kind of removing time-consuming, boring tasks on the part of people running the process or participants. And it can reallocate costs. So costs that might usually be used for a physical venue could be used to support the engagement of people who have accessibility needs and kind of enable them to take part. It allows a bit more of a wider reach, so you can get wider participation from a community. Something to stress as well is it's not necessarily there to replace in person, but is it can be seen as either an add-on or like something to exist alongside in-person events, so that you can reach a wider range of people. And that point around transparency and being able to package up outputs, it also allows for a kind of more co-productive approach, because people are able to see what's come out and contribute to it, rather than it all sitting with the designer or whoever's kind of holding the process overall. So next question, what might some of the barriers be to using digital? And these could be barriers for designers, or they could be barriers for participants. I'm going to ask you again. Hopefully I'm still coming through clearly. So what might some of the barriers to using digital engagement be for participatory processes?
I think that some users may find to be less confident with using technology that perhaps it's not sufficiently familiar to them, or they're simply scared that they will not perform well enough because it's a medium they're not accustomed to. So that might discourage them from actually participating.
Brilliant. Yeah, so thanks. That's about kind of their confidence levels of participants.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other barriers that people can think of?
I was thinking about accessibility to source resources. So some persons may not be able to have access to digital content.
Yeah, so people might not be able to get into the tools or the resources that they need to be able to take part. So I'll share some of these. So one would be technical skills. So people kind of understanding the basics of just how to use a computer, which is sometimes a bit of a barrier during participatory processes. And then even if they do know how to use a computer, can they get set up? Do they know how to find their way online? Are they familiar with the types of software you might be using? Do they need any particular skills in order to be able to take part in the process that you've designed? And then kind of related to that is confidence. So that's both confidence for you as a designer in the tool that you're going to be using, but then also, are your participants comfortable and confident in using the physical hardware, and also in their ability to use the software and go through the process and use the tools that you've got. And that confidence is really important because it kind of unlocks their ability to learn. If people feel safe enough to experiment and play with things, then they'll get the hang of it. But if they don't feel confident enough to try, then it can be a real barrier. It can put people off. Something else was around kind of access to resources, was the money and the budget. And for designers, that'll be a big factor in the tools that you choose to use, as well as how much support you can provide to participants and enable them to take part. For participants, it might determine whether or not they can have things like laptops and iPads and stable internet connections, which will really influence how they can engage with digital processes. Kind of related to that is internet connectivity. So can people get online? How remote are they? Have they got a kind of fast enough internet? It might be fast enough to go and do an online survey, but is it fast enough to do things like video call conversations? So that's a bit of a factor to consider for how you design that engagement. And then physical space is still a bit of a concern that needs to be something that needs to be considered for digital processes. So you still need a bit of a quiet space where you can go and take video calls, or somewhere to work and reflect, and have some privacy. And as I said earlier, often these processes are taking part in people's domestic space, and it's just an awareness of how that might affect the way that someone engages with you. And the last one is about this infrastructure and sustained support. So being really clear about who's organising the space and where people go to participate, who's taking the notes, what's happening with the outputs of your process, and if it's an online discussion board, who's moderating it, who's kind of running it. And these were some of the barriers as well, which was around people need to have a bit of an awareness of what kind of support is out there, and that it can be quite overwhelming if you're not a digital native. So starting with where people are in terms of like using their phones to help encourage them to get online. And there's something around just meeting the kind of basic needs for communities as well. So things like having access to Wi-Fi and broadband, having the basic equipment is often a really big hurdle. It can be difficult to overcome. So it's worth just having an awareness of that when you're going into these processes. Next section is on design and digital. So thinking about how you might use what these opportunities and barriers mean for how you might design a digital process. Oh, sorry. So it can kind of be helpful sometimes to think about how you might go about organizing a physical event to engage citizens, and then think about how that might translate into a digital environment. So behind any kind of engagement process, you'll have some key design principles, which might look something like this, where you've got accessibility and inclusion. So thinking about how the process can reach a diverse range of people and include them. Things like collaboration, so encouraging people to work together in an equal way, creating space for them to discuss and deliberate rather than just contribute individually. Creating a bit of a culture of welcoming and openness and learning, so that people can listen to each other's opinions, and newcomers feel welcome and comfortable and are confident to take part. And And that's an interesting one in terms of how you think about how it translates into an online platform, because you might not necessarily be having a call like this. You might have a moderated discussion board or a forum. So it's worth having a think about how you might create that in a written environment, who might need to be doing the moderation, and how might you ask questions to help get conversation going. Kind of related to that is trust and transparency. So people feeling like they can trust the space and trust the process, and you as designers holding the process being kind of transparent about why they're here, what the process is for, and where their input is going to go. And that's kind of related as well to action and impact. So it's not just talking shop, but something changes as a result of a person engaging in the process so that their energy is going somewhere. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a one-way street. So it doesn't just need to be a process of saying, government, we want you to do this. It might be a matter of documenting how citizens, as part of the process, have taken action within their communities. But that's really part of kind of closing the feedback loop and making sure that people know that something has come out of their engagement. So another good principle is to try and keep it simple, and use tools that you as a designer feel comfortable with, whilst considering the skills of participants and facilitators and anyone else who might need to use the tools. If you don't feel comfortable with it as a designer, then chances are participants probably won't either. So you have to kind of use your gut and base it around an understanding of your skills and the skills of your participants. Working out the needs first and then picking the tools rather than the other way around can be really helpful, to keep kind of accessibility in mind, rather than being like, oh, that's a really cool tool, I'd love to try it out. It has to still fit the needs of your participants. And something else as well is that it doesn't have to be an either or. You might not need a tool that does everything. You might find that using a combination of tools might be more effective than trying to use one tool that does everything. And I've got that little kind of icons of a Swiss Army knife versus a set of cutlery, because sometimes what you need isn't a Swiss Army knife. You might, depending on the context, you might need a whole set of tools that are relatively simple but still do the job better than having a one-stop shop. So it's really important to kind of understand your needs and adapt the tools around them rather than the other way around. And some kind of useful questions as a designer when going into a digital process to ask might be, what is the purpose you're trying to achieve? So where do you want to get to with your participants as part of this process? How comfortable are you in using that tool or platform? How long would it take you to familiarize yourself with it in an effective way? So you might have to have a bit of a learning process to get comfortable with it, but can you do it in the time that you've got to then allow you to get other people online and use it effectively? Is it feasible to use the technology based on our budget and know-how? So that's kind of considering some of those barriers and restrictions that you might face. Does the tool fit the need on all those different kind of barriers that you might face? And what resources and opportunities are there that you can build from already? So what you already have within your kind of organization or communities where you've got approaches that you can already use, rather than building it from scratch. And part of that is having lovely colleagues that you can go to and ask for support, or like drag into your processes to help kind of teach you how to use the tools, or to help upskill your participants if you've got the time and budget for it. And some kind of questions you could ask participants to help put yourselves in those shoes is who's going to use the tool, how familiar are they with the technology, and how easily can they learn how to use it in an effective way. And kind of related to that is thinking about their overall experience. So when people are coming into these online spaces, how are they feeling welcomed or shut out, or is it clear where they need to go to find out about the process? And will this technology enable them to cover their identified need, or might you need a kind of combination of tools? And kind of, yeah, as I said, like using the support of colleagues as well, or setting up support for participants if you can. So thinking about those kind of design questions, how might you actually do a recruitment and delivery process with digital? Before jumping to use tools, it's kind of worth thinking about who you want to reach. As we said, what resources you've already got. So as you're preparing for this process, having a bit of a kind of community mapping to understand who and where your community groups of interest are, maybe developing targeted audience profiles like Nigel was talking about, so that you can really understand the audience or community that you want to reach. What do they enjoy? What are they passionate about? What could encourage them really to sign up? And then shaping your communications and messages around that. So communicating the most important piece of information first, being really clear about it, what it is you're asking them to do and how long for, and where they can get involved. And you'll see the kind of, for those of you in this morning's session, you'll see the overlap between effective comms. And then it's also important to consider how your whether your audience is already online and whether an online process is going to be visible to them. And if not, how can you make this digital process more visible to people who are more kind of analog or physical? So where might this go around your neighborhood or community? Could you put posters in supermarkets? Could you go to the community with tablets yourself if it's safe to do so? How might you go about recruitment in person? And then thinking about some quite common recruitment tools. We've already spoken briefly about things like neighborhood apps like Nextdoor, but you'll also be familiar with things like social media, like the traditional kind of Facebooks and Twitters and Instagrams, which are all good for engaging slightly different communities and groups of people. And you've got things like neighborhood WhatsApp groups, which are often a really good way of reaching local areas, because there will often be a neighborhood WhatsApp. And if you can get the word out on that local level, you can start to engage people in the community. And then you've got things like mailing lists, so things like MailChimp and SurveyMonkey, where you can do kind of traditional email style comms, and then not to forget things like physical posts and leaflets. And a good kind of rule of thumb here is to keep it fun, and to make sure that people have some reason in terms of like just feeling excited to come to an event, and considering what might make them feel excited or interested, and then kind of increasing their commitment as time goes on, but starting off by making it fun and making it open. Everyone loves to come to a celebration, so kind of testing and co-designing spaces as well. So once you've got people involved and once they feel like it's fun, taking them on a bit of a journey, trying to include them in what you do, but and considering how they can benefit from the space, and shape the space to suit their needs. and yeah, just that kind of principle of fun is really important for that initial stage of engaging with people. So some tools as well for running a PB event online. These might include things like event description tools, so things like Eventbrite, where that's really helpful because it will allow you to know how many people are coming to your event, but it will also enable you to kind of have their contact details for future, so you can sustain that engagement. Things like video conferencing we will all be really familiar with, and we've already kind of mentioned earlier that struggle with having things like breakout groups, and then we've got things like collaborative writing tools, like Google Docs. You might have discussion tools like Mighty Network or Basecamp, which can be useful as a kind of forum for people to share ideas and contribute asynchronously, but will require a bit of kind of moderation in between your online meetups or physical in-person meetings. And then you've got things like ideation tools, which are great for kind of blowing up ideas and having loads of post-its. But it's important to bear in mind as well, someone needs to come back to those and kind of bring those ideas together and synthesize them into something. And that might be working groups, or it might be you as a designer in between your meetings working together. You've got things like voting tools, so narrowing down from your kind of broad ideas, how do you narrow it back down into a set of recommendations or select ideas to go forward with. So you might use something like Mentimeter for that. And then you've got purpose-built platforms, so things like Commonplace, Your Priorities, Console, which are really that kind of Swiss Army knife approach to it is a purpose-built platform for PB, and we'll do a lot of those kind of individual pieces that we've spoken about there, but obviously comes with some costs attached. And then a few kind of ideas for digital comms during a PB process. So a lot of these tools will look similar to the tools that you might use during the recruitment process, and really the principle here is to go where people are rather than expecting them to come to you. So wherever they're most comfortable, trying to seek them out, be that on a kind of dedicated Facebook group that you set up, or using emails or WhatsApp groups. And that really goes to understanding your audience. And then also having a bit of a dedicated space so that the information isn't spread out over loads of different places, but people can go to one site and find out what the latest is on this process that you're leading them through. And you've got a little bit of a table there on the right about the different tools that you might use for different purposes. And we'll share a link at the end as well to an Airtable that we've got set up, which is a bit of a database of the different tools you might use to do PB, sorted by their functions. These are some of the kind of feedback on digital tools as well. So communities often want their own digital tool platform. So that's about having that kind of dedicated place. There is rarely one digital tool that does everything. So having lots of simple tools might be the best way to go in order to kind of meet the various needs that you have, both of the participants and of the process that you're trying to get through. And then something else just to bear in mind as well is that once an online space gets a bit of a vibe of being a tumbleweedy desert, it can be quite unwelcoming. So it can take a lot of kind of energy from you as the person setting up the space to ask questions and put content on there and kind of create the energy needed to get things going for participants to feel comfortable speaking their mind into it. And I'm almost done. You won't have to listen to me much longer, I promise. And this is just a bit of a thoughts about the future and learning from a couple of case studies. So future is hybrid. So it's not going to be an either or between either online processes or in person. Increasingly, we'll see like the use of phones in in-person events, and we'll have like things like hybrid meetings. So how can these kind of tools be combined as part of your process? How might you use them to include people who might traditionally have been excluded from physical events? And if people can't gather physically at the same time, what can they do out in their time outside of meetings, working asynchronously? And you'll see there was a little photo on the last slide as well of this kind of, at the top right there, you'll see we've got a little gallery. So this is learning from some citizens' assembly processes. And it's a good kind of example of how we combine lots of different digital tools in quite a simple way as part of an online deliberative process. So we'll be using Zoom with facilitators holding discussions on the day. We might have Miro boards going with facilitators taking the action and notes off the back of conversations that are happening. We'll then communicate that publicly. So you'll see that we've got like screenshots of Twitter of before and after, showing off and celebrating all the hard work that our lovely assembly members do. And we might ask the assembly members to do some work asynchronously. So at the top right, there's that kind of gallery of Newham, which is about, this one's about 15-minute neighborhoods, and our assembly members were asked to go and do a tour of their neighborhoods and send photos with descriptions of what they saw. And then we kind of receive the photos and put them up on the site, and then they can all see them and learn from them together. In terms of DEMOTEC, I think this is kind of particularly interesting because it's about how you combine a bunch of different tools in a way that isn't exorbitantly expensive, in a way that is also quite accessible for participants and doesn't create loads of work on their end. Does create a fair amount of work on our end as designers, but that's always a kind of balance between accessibility and taking on the work yourself. So key takeaways, and then I'll hand back to Annie because I'm sure you're all sick of listening to me now. Looking back, it's important to kind of consider the opportunities, barriers and needs first before jumping to use particular tools. Understand your networks and go where people are rather than expecting them to come to you. And 3 simple tools might be easier than 1 complicated one. So really understanding what resources you've got available, what skills you have and what skills you can learn, and not being afraid to combine tools if that makes things easier. And that the future will be hybrid, and then we'll be using a kind of combination of digital and physical tools. Thank you all. Hopefully that was interesting. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and